Evan Marlow smiled into the camera. His pregnant wife, Lara, and their 2 young daughters had vanished just hours earlier. But there he stood, pleading for their safe return with steady eyes and a calm voice. The world saw a grieving husband. The police saw something else. What they would uncover in the days that followed would shock the nation. A crime so cold it defied belief. How could a father commit the unthinkable and then smile for the world to see? To anyone on the outside, the Marlow family seemed flawless. They lived in a 2-story house at the end of Oak Ridge Lane, the kind of place with blooming flower beds, wind chimes on the porch, and a welcome mat that never had dirt on it. Evan Marlow, the man of the house, wore button-down shirts and polished shoes, always on time for church, always polite to neighbors, always ready with a smile. His wife, Lara, was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, hosted book clubs, and kept a handwritten planner. Their 2 daughters, Emily and Rose, were bright-eyed and energetic, always dressed in coordinated outfits, always laughing. And soon there would be one more. Lara was pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy. They looked like a family out of a catalog. No one ever heard them argue. The girls played in the front yard without supervision, riding scooters and drawing with sidewalk chalk while Evan mowed the lawn and Lara watched from the porch. On social media, their lives played out like a curated dream. Family picnics, sunset selfies, homemade pancakes. There were birthday balloons, Mother's Day brunches, Christmas trees taller than the ceiling. Not a single photo out of place, not one post that hinted at trouble, but it was all a carefully constructed illusion. Behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they appeared. Evan had started working late more often. Lara, though still posting smiling photos, had begun looking tired. There were small signs that most people would overlook. Evan's absence at parent-teacher conferences, Lara canceling book club last minute, Emily mentioning to a neighbor's kid that Daddy sleeps on the couch sometimes now. The cracks were forming, but no one noticed them. Or perhaps they didn't want to. After all, what reason would anyone have to suspect that anything was wrong with the Marlows? If there was tension in the home, it was buried under layers of polite smiles and practiced normalcy. Lara kept showing up to every prenatal appointment. Evan kept cutting the grass in perfect rows. And the girls kept laughing and drawing chalk hearts on the sidewalk. What no one saw was the silence that had crept into the house. Conversations that used to stretch into the night had become short and sharp. Lara had questions. Evan had excuses. There were moments when she would look at him too long, like she was trying to read something on his face. But Evan never gave her anything. He was practiced. He was calm. And more than anything, he wanted control. By early summer, something had shifted in Evan. He'd started taking long drives without telling Lara where he was going. He told her it was for work. New clients, late closings, last-minute property visits. In truth, he was seeing someone else. A coworker. Younger. Carefree. Someone who didn't ask questions or expect loyalty. Someone who didn't come with 3 children. 1 unborn. Lara had found a receipt one evening. 2 meals, 1 glass of wine, and a hotel room hours away from home. She didn't say anything that night. She simply folded it and placed it in her nightstand drawer. What went through her mind in that moment is impossible to know. Did she plan to confront him? Did she think about leaving? Or was she afraid of what Evan might do if she pushed too hard? The illusion of a perfect life was crumbling, but from the outside it still sparkled. No one knew that Lara was documenting things, dates, notes, texts, quietly collecting pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet understand. No one knew that Evan had already made up his mind. As the days passed, he smiled at neighbors, waved to passing cars, and took his daughters for ice cream. Lara continued planning the nursery, folding baby clothes and scheduling appointments. The girls continued being just children, unaware of the tension thickening around them. And somewhere, deep in Evan's mind, a terrible plan had already taken root, one that would destroy the illusion forever. It was a warm Monday morning when everything changed. The kind of morning where the sunlight hits the windows just right, and birds chatter in the trees like nothing in the world could go wrong. But inside the Marlow house, it was unusually quiet. The curtains were still drawn, the driveway empty. Lara Marlow and her two young daughters, Emily and Rose, were gone. At first it didn't raise alarms. Evan told a neighbor that Lara had taken the girls to visit her sister a few towns over. He said it casually, smiling, sipping coffee from a travel mug. He climbed into his SUV, waved like he always did, and drove off to work without a second glance. It was routine, just another day. But by early afternoon, something didn't sit right. Lara hadn't called her sister. She hadn't answered texts. She hadn't posted anything online, which was unusual for someone who normally shared daily updates, even if it was just a quote or a baby bump photo. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her best friend called, then texted, then called again. Nothing. She missed a prenatal checkup that she never would have forgotten. Still, Evan remained calm. He texted a few friends, asking if anyone had heard from her, called police later that night that maybe she just needed space, that sometimes she got overwhelmed. But Lara wasn't the kind of person to vanish, not with two small children and a baby on the way. By evening, concern turned into panic. Her sister, who hadn't seen or spoken to Lara all week, called the police and reported her missing. Officers arrived at the house around 9 p.m. Evan was home, still dressed in work clothes, and invited them in. He answered questions smoothly, without hesitation. He said he left at 6:45 a.m., kissed Lara goodbye, and assumed she was still sleeping. Said the girls were in bed when he left. He gave them permission to search the house, even offered to help. The house looked untouched. No signs of forced entry. The beds were made, the kitchen was clean. Lara's purse was still on the counter, her phone charger still plugged in, but her phone was gone. Her car, too, had vanished without a trace. It didn't add up. The next morning, police canvassed the neighborhood and asked for any surveillance footage. One neighbor, a retired electrician named Don, had a motion-activated security camera pointed at the Marlow driveway. He offered the footage without thinking twice. What it revealed changed everything. At exactly 5:24 IEM, Evan's truck backed into the driveway. Not forward, as he usually parked. Slowly it reversed into the garage. It sat there for nearly 45 minutes, engine idling. Then at 6:10 IEM, it pulled out and drove away. No one else was seen leaving the house. Not Lara, not the children. When officers asked Evan about the footage, he seemed momentarily caught off guard. Then he recovered, said he was loading work tools and didn't want to scratch the lawn. He repeated the story twice. Same tone, same words, same practiced calm. But something didn't sit right with detectives. That kind of parking, that long in the garage? The timing didn't align with his story. And then there were the inconsistencies. Small ones at first. Evan said he left the bedroom light on, but it had been off when police arrived. He claimed Lara had packed a weekend bag, but nothing was missing from her closet. He said the girls took their favorite toys, but both stuffed animals were still on their beds. The more they examined his story, the more it frayed at the edges. By the second day, the search widened. Bloodhounds, drones, community volunteers. Flyers went up all over town. The media picked up the story. Pregnant mother and two daughters vanish without a trace. Evan appeared on the evening news, standing on his front porch pleading for their return. His voice trembled. His hands shook. He even cried. But behind the sadness, there was something strange in his expression. A flicker of something else. A smile, brief but unmistakable. And from that moment on, suspicion turned to certainty. The interview aired on the third night after the disappearance. Evan stood in front of his home, flanked by porch lights and a pair of planters filled with perfectly trimmed lavender. He wore a navy blue shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy, eyes red. The reporter asked him how he was holding up. what he would say to Lara if she were watching, what he wanted the world to know. His answers were calm and soft-spoken, laced with just enough emotion to sound real, but not enough to seem broken. He paused often, looked down, blinked slowly. He said he was worried sick and just wanted his girls home. The video made the rounds online within hours. At first, sympathy poured in. Hundreds of comments offered prayers, hope, support. But beneath the surface, something strange was taking shape. People began dissecting the footage, frame by frame. They zoomed in on his face, slowed down the clip, listened closely to the tone of his voice. A chilling detail emerged. At exactly 1 minute and 42 seconds into the interview, Evan looked directly at the camera, and for the briefest moment, he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was subtle, barely there, a slight upward twitch of the lips, a flicker in the eyes. But it was enough to set off alarms. Viewers began posting comparisons to other high-profile cases, drawing lines between Evan's behavior and that of men who had once pretended to be grieving husbands. Until the truth came out. Something about Evan's body language didn't match the urgency of a man who had lost everything. As public suspicion grew, investigators dug deeper. They combed through Evan's phone records, bank statements, browser history. What they found cracked the surface wide open. There were dozens of text messages between Evan and a woman named Haley, his coworker. The texts were affectionate, flirty, intimate, but more than that, they were telling. In one message, Evan said he was tired of pretending. In another, he wrote, "I can't do this family thing anymore. I just want out." The affair had started 5 months earlier, slowly, quietly. It had escalated over time. Hotel rooms in neighboring towns, late-night meetups, whispered promises of a future without baggage. Evan had told Haley that his marriage was over, that he and Lara barely spoke, that the girls were too much for him. What he hadn't told her was that Lara was pregnant, or that he was lying to both of them. Investigators also discovered that Evan had searched online for information about how to erase location data, and, most disturbingly, how long does it take to smother someone in their sleep? All the while he continued to act like a grieving husband. He handed out flyers, he thanked volunteers, he offered a reward. But when questioned by detectives, his answers began to falter. His timeline shifted slightly each time. He forgot small details, then corrected himself. He claimed he didn't leave the house until 6:45 a.m., but GPS data from his phone showed he was already on the highway by 6:20. When pressed, he shrugged and said maybe he left earlier than he thought. Maybe he got confused. Maybe it was the stress. Then came the biggest break. A neighbor's outdoor security camera, the same one that showed Evan's truck backing into the garage, had captured audio. Faint, muffled, barely audible, but real. At approximately 5:32 a.m., a high-pitched scream could be heard, followed by what sounded like a thud. A second, shorter scream followed a few minutes later, then silence. Nothing else, just the soft rumble of an idling engine. It was the moment everything shifted. Investigators knew, then, that they weren't dealing with a missing person case. They were dealing with a crime. One that had been carefully covered, yet sloppily executed. A husband who pretended to grieve, a father who smiled into a camera, and a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. The walls were closing in, and Evan Marlow was running out of places to hide. Evan cracked on the 5th day. He hadn't planned to confess. He hadn't planned to show emotion. But the evidence was closing in from every angle, and for the first time, the mask he'd so carefully worn began to slip. After hours of questioning in a sterile interview room, under the cold hum of fluorescent lights, Evan finally said 4 quiet words that turned the investigation on its head. "I'll take you there." He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for privacy. He simply leaned forward and gave investigators a location, coordinates to a place no one expected. It wasn't near the family home, not near any park or familiar site. It was a remote oil field, nearly 2 hours from Maple Grove, surrounded by nothing but rusted fences, dry grass, and heat shimmering off the ground. Detectives followed him there, unmarked cars kicking up dust as they drove down long forgotten service roads. The land was owned by a former oil company where Evan had worked briefly years ago, and although the equipment had been mostly decommissioned, some of the storage tanks were still standing. There, at the base of one of those tanks, Evan pointed to a patch of disturbed earth. The silence that followed was unbearable. With gloved hands, the forensic team began to dig. Less than 3 feet down, wrapped in a thin bedsheet, was Lara Marlow. Her skin was pale, her hair still damp from the morning shower she had likely taken just before she died. There were bruises around her neck, consistent with strangulation. Her arms were cradled over her swollen stomach, as if protecting the child who never had a chance to be born. A few yards away stood 2 large, weathered oil tanks. Heavy lids sealed them shut. Investigators pried them open one by one. Inside the first tank, floating in a foot of dark, chemical-stained water, was a child's body. Emily. In the second tank was Rose. Both girls were still in their pajamas. Both had been smothered. One blanket found in the truck that matched the fabric found in their lungs. It was the very same blanket they used during movie nights, the one with faded cartoon animals and tiny hand-stitched initials in the corner. It was clear Evan had planned the disposal well in advance. He knew the location, he knew the tanks. He even knew the lids locked in place, shielding the bodies from wildlife and detection. He'd driven them there before dawn, while the world was still asleep, and executed the entire plan before sunrise. The idea, clearly, was to make it look like they had simply disappeared. What shook investigators the most wasn't just the brutality, it was the precision. Evan had cleaned the garage meticulously, scrubbing the floor and rearranging tools. He had driven back home, showered, changed, made breakfast, and gone to work like any other day. And that same evening he had posted on social media a photo of Emily and Rose sitting on the porch steps with the caption, "Miss my girls so much," praying for their return. There was no emotion left in his voice when he recounted the events. He didn't cry, he didn't flinch. He simply explained it, like he was describing a real estate deal. Dry, calculated, without remorse. When asked why he did it, he said he felt trapped. He said Lara was controlling, that the girls made him feel invisible, and that he couldn't handle another child. In his mind, there was no other way out. But to those who heard the confession, it wasn't about stress, it wasn't about escape, it was about control. Evan Marlow hadn't snapped in a moment of rage. He had planned it, he had carried it out with chilling clarity, and he had smiled for the camera while the bodies of his family lay rotting in oil tanks beneath the blazing sun. The trial began under a cloud of disbelief. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, strangers who had followed the story obsessively. Everyone wanted to see the man who had once smiled so confidently on television, now shackled, unshaven, and hollow-eyed. Evan Marlow entered the courtroom wearing a beige jumpsuit, his hands bound in front of him. There was no emotion on his face, no hint of the carefully crafted charm he'd once used to disarm everyone around him. He barely looked up. But everyone else stared. The prosecution didn't waste time. They opened with a simple statement. This man murdered his pregnant wife and 2 innocent daughters because he wanted to live without consequences. It landed like a punch to the gut. What followed over the next few days was a devastating sequence of evidence. Texts between Evan and his mistress, search histories, footage from the neighbor's security camera, GPS data from his truck, even the receipts Lara had hidden in her drawer. Piece by piece they unraveled his timeline, exposing just how calculated the murders had been. There was no last-minute twist, no shocking revelation. Evan had confessed, but the real horror came from the details. A forensic pathologist described the injuries Lara sustained as she fought for air. A digital analyst broke down how Evan disabled Lara's phone tracking. A crime scene expert testified how Evan had wrapped his daughters in sheets, then stored their bodies in oil tanks like waste. Outside the courthouse, candlelight vigils turned into protests. People brought teddy bears, candles, flowers, and signs with words like "Justice for Lara" and "A Father's Betrayal." The entire town, once so charmed by Evan's perfect family image, now recoiled at the memory. The house on Oak Ridge Lane was soon boarded up, left to fall into silence and decay. No one wanted to live in a place where such evil had been so carefully hidden. On the final day of trial, the courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: 3 for first-degree murder, 1 for unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and multiple for obstruction and tampering. Sentencing followed swiftly: life in prison, no parole, no appeals. Nothing left to debate. And then, as the judge dismissed the court, something strange happened. Evan looked up, made eye contact with no one in particular, and smiled. Just for a moment. That same tight-lipped, calculated smile he'd worn on television the night he'd pretended to care. He was led away in chains, still silent, as the courtroom emptied. Years later, people still talk about the case. They talk about how perfectly he hid the darkness, how no one saw it coming, how he looked right into the camera with a hollow smile and told the world he missed his daughters, when in truth, he had buried one in a shallow grave and dumped the others in crude oil. He remembered the smile more than anything, because it wasn't the smile of a broken man. It was the smile of someone who thought he had gotten away with it. Evan looked up, made eye contact with no one in particular, and smiled. Just for a moment. That same tight-lipped, calculated smile he'd worn on television the night he'd pretended to care. He was led away in chains, still silent, as the courtroom emptied. Years later, people still talk about the case. They talk about how perfectly he hid the darkness, how no one saw it coming, how he looked right into the camera with a hollow smile and told the world he missed his daughters, when in truth, he had buried one in a shallow grave and dumped the others in crude oil. He remembered the smile more than anything, because it wasn't the smile of a broken man. It was the smile of someone who thought he had gotten away with it.